Hello and welcome to another edition of The Tigers Down Under. I'm your host, as always, Alex, and joining me tonight I have Logan.
Hello, everybody.
It's been a little while now, but it's still feeling pretty good after the last time out with a first win since the second week of the season. 2-1 win coming from behind against Southampton. How did you see it?
Yeah, I think exactly right. The spirits in the city camp can be somewhat renewed, and we're on a much greater high. In many ways, I think that Southampton probably were that opponent that we would have liked to have fancied our chances against, maybe getting a point. But I think we probably were maybe a bit naive, but yeah, somewhat surprised that we were able to collect all three. And I thought it was a much improved performance after a pretty dusty start.
And it was, it was, as you mentioned there, it was a pretty rough start with Davies conceding a penalty inside 5 minutes, and it seemed to sort of, initially at that point, it set the tone for the day that it just wasn't going to go our way yet again, that the luck was against us. And in some ways it reminded me, and we'll talk about Sunderland a bit later, but it reminded me of that game at the Stadium of Light where I think it might have been Davies in that game as well, who tried to pass the ball back to McGregor, and Sunderland scored in the first minute or second minute of the game, and in that game as well our heads sort of dropped a bit, but then we ended up winning it 3-1, and it didn't really rejuvenate our season that year, but hopefully this game can do that this year.
Yeah, certainly. That moment you mentioned when Johnson, I think it was, came
Yeah,
through
it was.
and same like it was Davies, and it seems to be one of those recurring trends with Davies. You know that he, whilst he is a very inspirational leader for us, and certainly as any regular City fan will know. That he does stand up for us in big occasions, but he has got that in him. And to be honest, I think it's probably the difference as to why it's prevented him maybe being capped as an England player, because there's a lot of talk, particularly at the start of the season with the first few games, where he was really, hitting all the leaderboards and stats for interceptions and whatnot. And people were calling for him to be called up again. But yeah, I guess when you see instances like that, you probably start to realise that is what keeps him out of the major accolades.
Yeah, I mean it was a bit of a weird one because I think it was Yoshida it wasn't even really heading into goal. He was making his way to the byline. It wasn't a particularly threatening move in that sense, and definitely wasn't one that needed to be hacked down. But on the more positive side of the game, obviously we scored two goals inside 125 seconds, which is a pretty speedy pair of goals. I think the only quicker I can think of would be the two we scored against Chelsea in that game to make it 2-2 before they beat us 3-2. But pretty speedy pair of goals for us, and Snodgrass at the heart of them. And what did you make of his game? I mean, he was only penciled in for about a 30-minute cameo, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I thought Snodgrass was massive, and I think, as you said, we kind of were wrestled with the idea of what Phelan was going to do with the formation, in the sense that Snodgrass is probably one of those players that you wouldn't really like to play centrally, and does he play, does he not? I think that kind of his role in the Southampton game just kind of reaffirmed to us, if there was any doubt, that he is certainly, if not our go-to player, especially in the form of delivery. And yeah, it's what he did against Southampton. Just, it can't be questioned. The stats speak for itself.
Do you think there's any danger that with the form that he's been in, that a club might come knocking in January?
I think there's always danger when you talk about your bigger players at any club. Snodgrass's goal return and assists suggest that in a struggling team, he seems to be the man that's standing up. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see someone come knocking on the door for him in January. But I do also wonder about Snodgrass's loyalty. I think that he seems to be pretty content with his role at City, and I'd be very surprised to see him go for anything short of a massive bid in January.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that one. I feel like players who've had those sorts of long-term injuries do seem to have that sense of gratitude for clubs, so it would be good to see him stick around and stick out the season. And I'm sure, regardless of whether we're still in the division or not, he'd still earn a pretty decent move at the end of the season if he really wanted one, after having pretty much repaid us with his performances this season. Um, A player who had a series of good performances for us last season in Hernandez suffered a pretty bad injury early in the game, which will see him miss a month of the season. And Keane's also out, unfortunately, for the season. So both of our strikers suffered injuries pretty early in that game, which is what forced Phelan's hand to bring on Snodgrass. But what did you make of the news, particularly with Keane, I suppose?
Yeah, the Hernandez injury is always a blow for us. We know Hernandez's worth, and particularly when he can get going, just how capable he is of finding the net. So I think that one, particularly over this busy run, particularly with the game against Sunderland, it seems to be shaping as a as a survival game in November, to some degree. I think that we will always miss Hernandez, regardless of how much he misses, as far as time period goes. Will Keane's an interesting one. He came to the team with a lot of promise, and he probably hasn't really had the opportunities to show us what he's capable of in the first few weeks. I think in many ways, I've been reading a lot on the forums, and a lot of people seem to be taking the view that it's not too big a miss. But I think with a club like ours, and fostering younger players like that and developing them through, having Will Keane fit, and even if he's coming off the bench for kind of 20, 30-minute periods, he does offer that backup and assurance. So to lose him for the season is quite a blow.
Yeah, absolutely, and obviously it's always upsetting when a player has that sort of long-term injury. We've just talked about Snodgrass coming off one and looking so good for us. So it's clearly quite disappointing when a player is going to miss essentially 12 months of football at any stage of their career. So hopefully he has speedy and healthy recovery and can kind of get over these injury issues, because he's had a few, I think, in the past. I mean, I remember discussing when he first signed for us that he'd had a bit of a stop-start time at United, where he was ahead of Rashford in line for positions in the first team, but then had injury setbacks. So hopefully he can get over his injury issues and really sort of kick on in his City career. Unfortunately, that looks like it will be next year, though. It was interesting, though, with the fact that Hernandez and Keane were both injured early, that Phelan was sort of forced into bringing on Mbakani and Snodgrass and changing up the formation, and it all seemed to fall into place. But it was a bit funny to think that it essentially was substitutions that Phelan didn't choose to make, but that just sort of happened onto him.
Yeah, certainly, and I think that's probably something that we've been talking about recently too. With what is our best formation, who plays where, whether there was any unrest with Hernandez because he wasn't being played, why did Keane start by himself up top? All of those kind of topics that we've wrestled with. You're right in saying that when Phelan did have his hand forced into a change, everything just seemed to look much more fluent and go quite nicely for us. Whether that's a one-off case because it was just the Southampton game, or whether that actually suits us, is yet to be seen. But yeah, it was somewhat of a masterstroke from Mike Phelan without actually being Mike Phelan.
And one player who hasn't had a lot of words said about him, but he just seems to look so impressive every time I see him play, is Mbakani, who he's an interesting one as a striker because he's not scored a goal for us yet, but I can't think of any criticism that I've heard about his style of play for us, at least so far, where his hold-up play has been brilliant. He's brought other players into the game, and I think it was the fact that he was able to draw a few players to that near post for our first goal, where Klukas could then pull the ball back to Snodgrass. And even though he's not scoring goals himself, he's really making himself look dangerous, and I've really liked the look of him so far.
Yeah, certainly. I have to agree with you. I really like the look of Mbakani. He does just offer that little bit of flair. And he seems like every kind of moment that he's involved in the game is very intentional, and he's a very positive player to watch.
So then, apart from Snodgrass and I guess from my point of view, Mbakani, who would you rate as the top three players in the game?
It was very nice to see Dawson back on the score sheet, and I thought that he kind of led quite well from the back. He's definitely worth noting. But yeah, as you said, Snodgrass was certainly the key man. Outside of that, I thought it was just a well-rounded performance.
Yeah, it was good to see everyone sort of stepping up. And another one who deserves a bit of credit, because we've probably given a bit of ribbing on this podcast a few times, is David Marshall in goal, who really stepped up and towards the end of the game made a few spectacular saves, particularly from Charlie Austin, to keep our lead intact and to see out the game. But yeah, Phelan's kept the faith in him, and he's certainly paid him back this game.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that if we're being honest, he probably had to, in the sense that we know that the Yak's just in the shadows waiting for his chance, and seems to have the backing, or the majority backing, from the City faithful. So I fear that if Marshall wasn't to put in a performance that like he did, I think it would have been curtained for him, at least for now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll move our attention then just briefly to our relegation rivals, because it's all starting to shape up a bit at the bottom. Sunderland, who we played this weekend, and we'll talk about in a second, got their first win of the season against Bournemouth. And I just wanted your opinion on that. Do you see it as a positive from our point of view that Sunderland have got that win under their belt, and so there isn't that added pressure on us that, Sunderland... Going into the game, if Sunderland hadn't had a win, that there would have been that little bit extra pressure to sort of keep them winless, and pressure on them also to try and get that win against a fellow bottom three side? Or do you see it more as they've got that win now and they might actually get some momentum going?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that them winning is probably a good thing for us. I think that Sunderland at the Stadium of Light are always, with the hostile crowd that the North East dishes up, you're never going to have an easy game there. But I guess in the same kind of sense as you know that St James Park is a similar kind of atmosphere, that the fans are very quick to turn on them. And I do wonder whether, if they were to still not have their win and we arrive there, what kind of reception they would get, whether it's one of those games where it becomes a very tense kind of atmosphere for them and they crumble under the pressure, or if in fact it does the opposite and inspires them. But yeah, to me, to answer the question, I think that beating Bournemouth might not have been such a bad thing for us.
Swansea lost to United. I think it was 3-1 in the end there. And Swansea are definitely starting to look pretty listless at the bottom of the table. And I think they're essentially bottom if Sunderland pick up any sort of points against us this weekend. It's not looking too good for Swansea at this stage.
No, certainly not. And particularly when you kind of, we've gotten used to the brand of football that Swansea have played over the last few seasons. They've been renowned for their ability to pass the ball around and kind of play teams off the park, so to speak, with just the amount of passes they string together and the style of play. And they certainly just look a shadow of their former selves.
And I think they're the only team in the bottom five who didn't pick up any points that weekend, because I think West Ham also managed to get... was it a draw against... who did they have? They had Stoke, yeah, so they drew with each other, which gave them both points. So it's a bit concerning for Swansea from that point of view. West Brom are pretty impressive to beat Leicester, while Burnley were able to beat Palace, and both teams really impressed in those games and really pulled away from the bottom three. While Middlesbrough got a really late draw with Man City. So a couple of sides starting to look quite promising and really making it a tough contest to get out of the bottom three at this stage.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it just highlights the importance of that win against Southampton, just to keep us in chasing distance or a stone throw away, because it really is starting to look like a fairly congested table. And I fear that if we hadn't have got that result, that trip to the Stadium of Light, particularly with Sunderland having won, might have put an incredible amount of pressure on us.
Huddleston, the expert, with the free kick. Davis! 1-0 to Hull. And Curtis Davis, who scored an important goal in the last round against Brighton, repeats the trick to put Hull in front in the quarter-final.
So we've just heard their pretty fantastic goal against Sunderland in the FA Cup on the way to the final just a couple of years ago, and that was probably our most famous win over them in recent memory. But it was a pretty good season for us against them that year, where we beat them 1-0 and 2-0 in the league and then 3-0 in the Cup. But even the following season, I mean, we've already talked about the 3-1 win at the Stadium of Light, and I think it was a pretty unfortunate 1-1 draw at home from memory, where Rodwell might have had a hand in, quite literally, in scoring the equaliser. But we've had a good record against them recently. So what do you make of this game?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you talk to any Sunderland fan, they will always remind you of how much they don't like playing Hull, purely because of that, in the sense that we have seemed to have the wood over them in recent times. Whether that counts for anything at the moment, I'm not so sure. I think it might, and I dare say this, I think it might be probably to our detriment that we have had such a good run over them in recent times, and we all know that good runs come to an end. And let's just hope that it's not this weekend.
Yeah, I think you're right in that sense that reading too much into that record, I think had a lot to do with Bruce managing the club and really galvanising the squad against his former club, and in particular Myler and Elmo, who also have links to Sunderland. And whether that continues this weekend will be really interesting to see. But when you consider the fact that we've played, I think, Burnley, Swansea, and I'm not sure who else out of the bottom sides we've faced so far. I mean, I guess Bournemouth and Stoke, you could say, are bottom sides as well, but they probably of a little bit higher calibre. But we've done pretty well so far with the win against Swansea and a draw against Burnley. So at least from that side of things, there's a bit of confidence that Phelan should be able to get us in the right headspace for this game.
Yeah, certainly. I'd be surprised if he was going there targeting anything but 3 points. And I think that obviously has to be the aim against a struggling Sunderland side that we would have to fancy our chances against.
Who do you reckon comes into this game with more confidence? Obviously, we've both come off wins. We've already discussed Sunderland's beating Bournemouth last week and now beating Southampton. I think actually both teams coming from behind as well, so there's even that extra bit of confidence that they can pull a win out of the jaws of defeat. I guess at home for Sunderland, but as you've already touched on, I mean, it's a pretty unforgiving atmosphere up there, so it might actually be to their detriment playing at home.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't think you can really split this game. I don't think that any side will kind of go in feeling like they've, got their tails up more so than the other. I think it's going to be a very even contest, and like we said, that kind of volatile atmosphere will be interesting to see what role it plays in the outcome of the game. But a very, very important game to be playing. We're only in November.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's crazy how much pressure on these games already, and as you say, it's just November, but already the table looks like it's starting to thin out a little bit, and there's a lot of pressure on these games, and they're definitely 6-pointers in the sense that if we can pull away from Sunderland by an extra 3 points, it could make all the difference at the end of the season. Do you foresee many changes to the 11? Obviously, Keane and Hernandez out with injuries, but in the sense that I guess Mbakani and Snodgrass come off the bench and into the 11 to replace them. But apart from those two, do you see anyone else maybe coming in or out of the side?
I'd be surprised to see too many changes, but I think it will also depend on who comes back from the international games, if there's any fresh injury concerns or anything like that, which may still alter the lineup. But as far as tactical changes, I'd be surprised to see any real kind of movement, but you never know.
Yeah, and on the topic of the international games, I mean, I think David Myler came off the bench for Ireland in their win against Austria, which was good to see. I think he came on at around 20 minutes for an injury to Glenn Whelan, and by all reports had a pretty good game. And Mbakani played out the 90 minutes for the Democratic Republic of Congo in their 2-1 win, I think, coming from behind in that game as well. So he's had a pretty good week in terms of come from behind victories. But from the perspective of his fitness, it's good to see he could manage 90 minutes in that game. And I think Henriksen and Diamande were both involved for Norway in their 2-1 defeat to, I forget who they played in that one, but a couple of our players involved in international games. But from the sounds of things, all looking okay fitness-wise.
Yeah, certainly, and that can only be a good thing. I think it probably highlights just how important now having Mbakani fit up top with the loss of Keane and Hernandez. And I think if we were to lose him, then things would certainly get interesting as far as who leads our line. But as you mentioned, for him to get through 90 minutes is certainly a positive sign for us.
And speaking of strikers, and it does remind me that I think Jared Bowen re-signed to a new 3-year deal, taking him through to 2019, which was great to see because obviously he made his Premier League debut a few weeks ago against Stoke. And it's great to see those youngsters coming through and then getting rewarded for it. So good to see him signing a new deal. He's probably the next in line, to be honest, sitting on the bench as a backup striker. But other than him, I think Edwards, who we signed from Peterborough in the off-season, I think he's got something ridiculous, like 7 goals in the last week of fixtures, and he might get a chance off the bench.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that with the state that we're in, if Mbakani were to be injured, and we did find ourselves in the very intriguing position that Edwards and Bowen were our first
Yeah.
choice, would be incredible. It'd be a sensational situation to find ourselves in, but one that at the moment is not too unrealistic.
Yeah, and it's one of those situations where, especially for Jonathan Edwards, I mean, with the amount of goals that he's scored, he has that sort of confidence in him, and as an option off the bench, he might just sort of take the game by the scruff of the neck. A bit of adrenaline, bit of optimism on his Premier League debut, and who knows what might happen. But it'll be interesting to see if he earns himself a spot on the bench against Sunderland, and who knows if late in the game, if we need a winner, he might get a chance.
Yeah, certainly, and I think that'll make the run up to Christmas all the more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get your tips for the game, I'll ask you who you think has most at stake heading into this fixture.
Oh, very interesting. Good question. Look, I'm going to be a controversial one. I think maybe Davies, just on the back of that era. But in saying that, that's a long stretch. I don't think Davies is it too much risk of losing his spot.
It is an interesting one because obviously when Keenan Hernandez went off injured, I think we switched to a 4-1-4-1 formation from memory, and I think we actually played Maguire as a deep playing midfielder, with Klukas still on the left at left back. But it'd be interesting to see if we stick with that sort of formation and whether that means we do drop one of the defenders. And as you say, I mean, Davies has been in spectacular form at the start of the season, and he's looked pretty solid the rest of the time. But it would be interesting to see which of the three gets dropped. I mean, I suspect Maguire's probably first in line at this stage, but yeah, you never know what might happen. And then I'll round off by getting a tip for the game.
I think it's going to be 2-1 City. I think that just with the way we're playing at the moment, I think with the atmosphere up there, I can see Sunderland scoring, particularly against the run of play or some strange deflection or something like that. I can see it getting on the score sheet. But I think that in the end, I think we will be too good.
Any chance I could get the goal scorers from you? Who do you reckon? Probably Snodgrass?
I think Snodgrass and Mason will score.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, I'll probably go with maybe a 1-0 for us. I think we might get a smash and grab victory up there, and it seems to be the pattern of things that we get a decent clean sheet win up there or score a couple of goals. So it'll certainly be an entertaining game and one with a lot of pressure riding on it, but one that I'm certainly confident that we can get 3 points out of. So thank you for coming on the podcast, Logan.
Not a problem.
And thank you everyone for listening in. Hopefully we've predicted the correct outcome and City can come away with another 3 points, 2 in a row, to get back on track and out of the bottom 3. So until next time, come on City. You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
Going higher and higher. There's no turning back, 'cause you're amber and black till you die.